image. Can you see that? Yeah. I told you last week that I see the world in black and white, and that's what my slides are going to look like today. So as I mentioned, by the way, we do not have Sherry and Ray Damaso with us this morning, who are also original members of New Life Community Church and even before. So that's unfortunate this morning, but we're going to talk about them anyway. And so as I mentioned, New Life Community Church began in our living room in May of 1994. And on that same day, I was ordained as a pastor in that living room by a representative of the Great Commission Association of Churches, which we belonged to at the time. And the leadership of our church at that time was myself, Pete Gross, and Dwayne Lagerman, who was my mentor and great friend. And we decided to close our church that we had been in Iowa City and move to Cedar Rapids. And families like Mike and Angie Ranner moved from Iowa City to come here to plant this church. And I'll have more to say about that story in a moment. But when I think of New Life's story, one word comes to mind. It's faithfulness. Certainly the faithfulness of God, but also the faithfulness of God's people that helped to start this church and 30 years ago and remain with us today. We first talk about God's faithfulness. We read in Psalms, "Young and old will hear of your faithfulness. Your unfailing love will last forever. Your faithfulness is as enduring as the heavens." Why is it important for both the young and old to hear about God's faithfulness? Because the stories about what God has done in the past grows our faith in what God will do for us in the future. I've always said, our faith is based on our experience. And I want to remind us today of several examples of God's faithfulness to our church. Perhaps none of you have heard some of these stories, but many of you have heard many of these stories, and it's important for us to be reminded of them again today so that they continue to strengthen our faith in God. Our text today says of God, "Your unfailing love will last forever. Your faithfulness is as enduring as the heavens." Faithfulness is a good translation of the Hebrew word used twice in this text, and Webster's dictionary defines faithfulness as steadfast in affection or allegiance, loyal, as in a faithful friend. And we're going to talk about the faithfulness of people a little bit later in this message, and their loyalty and their love, because that's what's especially special to me. But I like the word loyal here. That is what it means for me, for someone to be faithful to you. They are loyal. And God has been faithful and loyal in New Life. But notice in the text how the psalmist defines faithfulness. He also describes it as unfailing love. God has demonstrated his faithfulness, loyalty, and unfailing love to New Life in many ways. I can first of all mention God's faithfulness to me. I had a successful business when we started the church in 1994, and God faithfully supported me while I was helping to minister in the church at that time. I was bivocational for about 4 years, and at that time I felt like I needed to make a decision. Both the church and my business were growing, and I wasn't doing a very good job at really leading either one. And so even though the church was not ready yet to support me full-time, I joined Dwayne in full-time ministry here at New Life Community Church and sold my business in 1998. And that was a big step of faith for Brendan and I because the church was not able to support us full-time at that time. Pete Gross was our treasurer, and he can tell you about this, that, I don't know, for maybe several months, this is how Dwayne and I were paid. At the end of a Sunday service, Pete would add up what was given. He'd take out the expenses and divide what was rest between Dwayne and I, and that's how he lived for a while. And but God demonstrated his faithfulness to us during that time. We always had everything that we needed. God has been faithful to me in many ways throughout that 30 years of ministry. In 2003, Pastor Dwayne left Cedar Rapids, and I became the lead pastor of the church. At the time, that felt very heavy to me. Let's see. So I was 29 when I became an elder. At this time, I don't know how old I was. Anyway, it felt heavy. And because I'd always been following Dwayne. And now I was the point guy. And I remember going to a park here in Cedar Rapids at that time and just wrestling with God about this. And I remember physically feeling, as I thought about this, this weight coming down on my shoulders. And I just began wrestling with God with that, praying. And as I was praying, I sensed that the weight didn't get any less, But it seemed like as I prayed, God was just strengthening me to be able to carry that weight. And I've been carrying that weight for all those many years by God's grace. I remember in that park that God reminded me of Gideon. And remember the story of Gideon. God gave Gideon a huge task, a task that was way bigger than him. And Gideon was telling God about all of his weaknesses. And the text says this: Then the Lord turned to him, Gideon, and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." And I have learned that's all that God really asks of us in ministry and the responsibilities he gives us, even as parents or whatever else. Go in the strength you have. Give what you are able to give, and God will do what he needs to do to fulfill his will. And I have experienced that in 30 years of ministry. Or as I often put it, do your best and trust God with the rest. And that applies to a lot of the Christian life, doesn't it? God has been faithful to our church. Some studies have suggested that only 20% of new church plants survive more than 5 years. We've made it 30 years. Only about 10% of churches are over 200 people in America. New Life has consistently been in that 10% of churches for many years now. How do we explain being in such a minority? God's faithfulness. Another example of God's faithfulness has been his willingness to always provide a place for us to meet. After my living room, it was the basement of the cafeteria the basement cafeteria at Hoover Elementary. I still remember the smell of sour milk in that place. I didn't like that place. From there, we moved to the hallway of Isaac Newton Christian School. Yes, the hallway. We grew and we moved into the Isaac Newton Gymnasium. And from there, we moved into Kennedy High School for a while. And who here remembers loading and unloading our church trailer every Sunday? I still have a scar right here from something that hit me in that trailer. And at the Isaac Newton Gym, we rolled out carpets every Sunday morning to cover that entire gym floor to help with the sound. That was a lot of work. And after that, we began meeting at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That was another one of my crazy ideas that just happened to work out. I thought, hey, those guys meet for church on Saturday. Maybe we could meet there on Sunday. And they agreed. So we met there for a while. Now, if you join New Life as either an adult or a kid, even as a baby, in any of those places, Hoover Elementary, Isaac Newton, Kennedy High School, or Seventh-day Adventist Church, could you stand today? I'm just curious. Yeah, all right, thank you. You remember those places. Well, in 2004, we began consistently praying that our church could have its own building. And we ended up with a plan to buy some property off of Edgewood Road and eventually build a building on that property. And one night, the leadership team was meeting, and in front of me on that table was the contract to purchase that land. And that's why we were having the meeting, was to sign that contract. And I remember as I'm standing there, I thought, and I said, guys, before we do this, let's check with that church one more time. During this time, this land and this building that we are in today had gone up for sale at $2 million. That was way over what we could afford. And so we were going in a different direction at the time. But that week, I met with the realtor one more time and I said, what is the best price you can offer me for this church? And he spoke with the church's leadership, and they came back, and the answer was $775,000, which is still a lot of money for us, but a lot less than $2 million. So we had a fundraising campaign, and not knowing if we could raise the money that the bank was even requiring for us to make this purchase. And we were praying that we would raise $300,000. And on Sunday, April 10th, 2005, we added up the pledges, and it was $301,000. Yes. $1,000 over what we were praying for, and maybe if we had been praying for more, we would have raised more. But $300,000 was a big ask of faith for us at that time. In fact, that $301,000 was given by only 37 households. That was over $8,000 per household. And many of us were young families. We didn't have all the money we have today. And so 20 years ago, we moved into this building and has faithfully served us as well. If we had signed that contract to purchase that land, we would have had half the size of the property we have now. We would have built a building that was half the size of this building, and it all would have cost us twice as much. So in that deal, we purchased twice as much land, a building that was twice as big for half the cost. God was faithful to us, and God has always been faithful to provide our church with the facilities that we needed. When we knew we were going to purchase this building, Brenda and I were living on the other side of town, so we decided to move closer to the building here, and Brenda started praying that we could buy a house right over here on Megan Drive. I thought that was a little crazy because the chances of that were very small. But we started monitoring that horseshoe of houses there, but eventually we gave up, and we found a house that was about 6 blocks away, and I thought, well, that's good enough. And so one day, we were on our way to meet our realtor at that house to make an offer to buy it. And as we were driving over here, Brenda said, let's just drive by Megan Drive one more time. And I said, well, it's on the way. Okay, let's do that. Sure enough, we turned off 29th Avenue here into Megan Drive, and right there, second house on the right, white house, a for sale sign was in the yard. I don't think it was even there the week before. I just looked at Brenda and said, you've got to be kidding me. And she just smiled at me like, I told you so. And I should have known better. I have learned that if my wife Brenda is asking God for something, look out, because it's probably going to happen. So we called our realtor who was waiting for us at the other house, and we said, hey, can you actually come over here and show us this house? And we bought it from a Christian man for less than half of what it's worth today. And God has also been faithful in our ministries. In 2004, we started the core campus ministries at Kirkwood and Mount Mercy College. And I remember meeting with some director, I think it was the director of religion or something at Mount Mercy College when we were starting the group there, and he told me, we'll let you be here on this campus, but you cannot proselytize or try to convert Roman Catholics. Well, God had a different idea. And we saw significant spiritual revival on that campus at that time. Dozens of college students got saved through the core campus ministry at both Kirkwood and Mount Mercy College. We definitely made an impact on that campus. In fact, I was told by that religious director at some point in time that there was a meeting of the leadership of the college there at Mount Mercy. And the president said during that meeting, I want the core off the campus. He was a hardcore Roman Catholic man. And he didn't like the fact that by far the largest group on the campus was the core campus ministry, which was not a Catholic group. And that director told me that during that meeting, he and a nun and one of the teachers stood up in that meeting, stood up for us, and told the president about all the good things that our core campus ministry was doing on that campus. And he relented, and we were able to remain on that campus. But God continued to show his faithfulness to us in that place. And afterwards, others have led that ministry, including Pastor Ben at some point. And the fruit of our campus ministry at Kirkwood and Mount Mercy was, again, another demonstration of God's faithfulness to New Life Community Church. If you came to New Life through those campus ministries, would you stand today? Come on, I know there you go. All right, thank you. You have a seat. If God had not blessed our campus ministry, our church would be very different today. We would have experienced what many churches experience, just getting old. And this is something so also very unique about New Life Community Church is we are very diverse demographically. God has been faithful to add to our number young families and elderly people, and we all love each other. Amen? It's a great thing about our church. And God has been faithful to bless us in our foreign ministries. We began by helping to plant a church in Monterrey, Mexico. And I think this was around 2006 or 2007. And let's see, I guess I'll tell this story. I remember a few of us, including the Lubtinsky family, driving cars from Cedar Rapids across the border and all the way to Monterrey, Mexico, taking our kids with us. And on the way back, we arrived at this border town in the middle of the night, and we were lost. We just kept driving around trying to find where we were supposed to cross the border. We didn't have GPS in those days, okay? So we stopped at this really sleazy gas station in the middle of this ghetto, and in the bathroom, we met a guy. And he said he could take us to the border. So we jumped in our cars and followed him to the border. And he led us there safely. I found out later that this border town was one of the most dangerous places in the entire world. All kinds of drug gangs were violently killing people in the very neighborhoods that we were driving through with our kids in these minivans. That guy from that disgusting gas station bathroom could have been leading us anywhere. To this day, I wonder if he wasn't actually an angel. Later, God took me to Cameroon, West Africa twice. Then starting in 2015, that was 9 years ago, I started going to India to teach at pastors' conferences there. And since then, of course, I've had the opportunity to minister to thousands of pastors in India and Nepal through conferences and some books. In that time, New Life has also raised and given over $500,000 to our overseas ministry. And none of us, including this church, have less money than we had before we gave all that money. God has blessed us for all of our giving, which is another reminder of God's faithfulness to this church. There's another demonstration of God's faithfulness to this church, all the people he has saved in this church. If you became a Christian or were baptized at New Life, would you also please stand today? Thank you very much. Thank you. You can have a seat. That is a testimony to God's faithfulness to Life Community Church. And as our text today says, of God, young and old will hear of your faithfulness. Your unfailing love will last forever. Your faithfulness is enduring as the heavens. And it has endured here at New Life Community Church. In the remainder of my message, we will especially see how God's faithfulness has been accompanied by the faithfulness of God's people to make the ministry at New Life Community Church possible. It is important that we celebrate God's faithfulness today, but you know what? I am more amazed at the faithfulness of the original members of New Life Community Church. Because God is always faithful. That's just a part of his character. But people, including Christians, I have found to rarely be faithful. If you find a faithful Christian, you have found a very rare person. And if that faithful Christian is your friend, then you have been very blessed. That's how I feel about my wife, Brenda, Pete Gross, Ray and Sherry Damaso, Mike and Angie Reiner, Ed Liptinsky, and Jan Hayes. Of course, we are grateful for all of you here today. Please hear me on that, no matter how long you've been a part of New Life Community Church. But today we are especially celebrating those who have been here for 30 years, from the very beginning. Actually, the story of New Life did not begin 30 years ago, but actually 40 years ago in 1984. This message is really making me feel old. And it should make some of you feel even older. At that time, Pete Gross and Mike Reiner were members of a small team that moved from Ames, Iowa to start a church at the University of Iowa. They converted from being Cyclones to Hawkeyes. That was part of their Christian growth, by the way. Joining that church in Iowa City is how I met Pete. In 1985, I came to the University of Iowa as a freshman, just out of the military and a new Christian. I was grateful to find the people I did in that church. And for example, Pete quickly became an important friend and mentor in my life. I did not like school that much. All I wanted to do was evangelism on the campus. That was where I was at that day. That's what I was like. And I wanted to be in full-time ministry even then, long before I was ready and long before it actually happened. But one night as a freshman in college, I was praying about this very thing. And that night, I became convinced that God wanted me to quit school and do ministry full-time. So the next morning, I went to see my friend Pete and to tell him the good news. Well, he just looked at me and he was silent. And I was shocked. Why wasn't he excited about my decision? And he went on to tell me all the dumb reasons that I would have to quit school. And that was the first time of many, many times in our 40-year friendship that Pete has kept me from doing something dumb. And his counsel and friendship in my life has been one of the greatest demonstrations of God's love and faithfulness for me. For many years, Pete was an elder in our church and served us very, very faithfully in so many ways. Pete, would you stand today so we can thank you for all of your service to us today? He's right there. Thank you. before I joined that campus church in Iowa City, some of its members invited me to play volleyball one night. I showed up, and that is the first time I remember meeting Mike Rayner. And he reached out his hand, shook mine, and with a big smile said, "We're very glad that you're here." And I remember thinking, this is a guy I can trust. And just that brief encounter with Mike was one of the major reasons I joined that church. And Mike has made that same impression on many, many people since then. Very early at that church plant in Iowa City, Angie Kraft at the time joined that church plant as well. And her and Mike later got married. And of course, Angie has for many, many years, been a very amazing example of a faithful wife, mother, friend, and member of this church. And Mike and Angie have been among the most faithful and respected life group leaders at New Life for as long as I can remember. Very faithful. And so Mike and Angie, would you stand today so we can thank you for your faithfulness to us? Thank you. I also met my wife, Brenda, at the University of Iowa when she became a Christian in that campus church and joined us. And, talk about faithfulness. Brenda's followed me so many places. And, of course, we all know Brenda's faithfulness to this church. It would be impossible to calculate all of the hours she has spent serving us in this church for all those years. But even more importantly, she has been such a godly example of a wife and a mother for all those many years. In addition, in 2008, Brenda began our Awana outreach. And for 14 years, she served as its commander. And so many people in our church have faithfully served hundreds of children through our Awana ministry here at New Life Community Church. And several of those kids have come to Christ during that time, including children in our own families. And so, Brenda, would you please stand today so we can thank you for all of your faithful ministry to our church today as well. Thank you. It was at the University of Iowa that I met Ray Damaso for the first time. And my mentor, Dwayne, had led him to the Lord in one of the dormitories on campus there. And Dwayne asked me to go visit him. And so I knocked on his door, and I've told this story before. I knocked on his door, and he opened it about an inch. "Yeah, who are you?" And it took me about 5 minutes to actually have him get the door open and actually be able to come into his room. And but Ray warmed up to us, and God grew him, and we've been friends ever since. And Ray was an elder at New Life Community Church for many years here. He also led our worship Sunday after Sunday, beginning way back in Iowa City. At the U of I, Ray and Sherry met at that time as well, and later married. And obviously, Sherry has also been a very important member of New Life Community Church for 30 years. The amount of serving that Sherry has done, the number of people she has loved and changed their lives is beyond anyone's imagination, really. And if she had just been paid $10 an hour for all of the counseling she has done, she'd be a rich woman. 20 years ago, in 2004, Sherry was willing to join me in another one of my crazy ideas to start a counseling ministry at New Life that would rival what even professionals can do. And many people owe a great debt of gratitude to Sherry for taking that on with me. And as I mentioned, Ray and Sherry are not with us today, but if you have the opportunity at some time, thank them for their faithful service to New Life Community Church for 30 years and more. Ed Levtinsky also came from Ames, Iowa, and joined us in the church plant in Cedar Rapids 30 years ago. And later, he married his wife, Michelle, here at New Life. For all those years, Ed has been a foremost example to us all in his heart and desire for evangelism and reaching the lost. He's always thinking about the lost and how to reach them. And our church has been very blessed by that. Ed's sister, Jan Levtinsky, at the time was also a founding member of New Life. I remember something that impressed me about Jan from the very beginning. Even as a very young Christian, she had a conviction about financially giving to the church. And that's another definition of faithfulness. Ed and Jan, would you please stand today so we can thank you for 30 years of commitment to New Life Community Church. Thank you. Hands back there. Actually, the Damasos, the Latinskys, and the Reiners have been generously giving to New Life for all of those many years. They could have bought so many nice things with all that money that they have given to the church. Money that has financially supported me for example, all those years. Money that helped to pay for all those places we've met, including this building. In addition, the Damasos, Levtinskis, and Reinerts have godly marriages and have raised godly families. Of course, no marriage or family is perfect, but if you want to compare these families to most families, even in American Christianity, you will notice a difference. Raising godly families has been a core value of New Life since our very beginning, and these founding families have been an example to all of us in those very things. Because of their faithful and generous giving, because of all the ways they have served us for so long, because of all their faithfulness to God, to raise godly families as an example to us all. Again, we're just very grateful for that example over so many years, and we're very grateful for that. Finally, there is someone else we want to thank for their faithfulness today. This is the children of the founding members. Whether they were present on the first Sunday of this church or not, they remain faithful to New Life Community Church. And again, this is a very rare thing. It is a sacrifice. There are so many other places and people and jobs and even churches that have called out to our children over that time. There are times our own children have been hurt or disillusioned or misunderstood in some way in this church. And even so, they've stayed and they've remained faithful. And that is an extraordinary demonstration, again, ultimately, of their faithfulness to God. So if you were a child of a founding member of New Life, would you stand today so we can thank you for being here as well? Okay. Well, there's just one other way that God's faithfulness and faithfulness of God's people has blessed New Life that I want to mention today. And since beginning 30 years ago, God has been faithful to raise up the godly leadership that our church needed. This is something else quite unique about New Life. We would never hire a staff member from outside of our church. We've always raised up our pastors and leaders from within our church because that's the best way to know their character. And New Life's leadership is another example of how God's faithfulness and the faithfulness of people have converged to bless New Life. Brian Hagerman was ordained in 2009 and has faithfully served us all those years. New Life is a better church because of Brian's leadership and his friendship and his faithfulness to us, especially his loyalty to me, I think, of today. Just last week in our pastors' meeting, I was telling the guys again, I am not an easy person to be in leadership with. I sometimes have crazy ideas, like buying this building, helping to plant a church in Mexico, and sending hundreds of thousands of dollars overseas to people we don't even know. Because all the pastors at New Life have had very different personalities, there has been some painful conflicts that we've had to work through with humility and love for one another. Our friendships have been tested, and I want to publicly thank Brian for always loving me and being a loyal friend to me in this church. In fact, just recently, Brian was offered a very nice and high-paying job in another city, and he turned it down. And one reason was his commitment to New Life Community Church. Again, only God knows all the time, work, prayer, and love that Brian has invested in this church. Brendan and I would tell you that his wife, Michelle, has been a very delightful and faithful friend to us as well. So, Brian and Michelle, would you please stand so we can thank you for all of that today? Thank you. Ben Hunt was ordained in 2015 and, of course, has been a great blessing to our church in so many ways. I never get tired of telling Ben's story, so I'm going to tell it one more time today. The first time I met Ben was right out here in this foyer, and he had a scowl on his face. And I said hi to him, and he might have said something back to me, but I don't think he even really looked at me. And when I met his wife, Jessica, later, I thought, why would such a nice woman marry a guy like that? But I was told that Ben had actually been a pastor before. And so when I met this scowling man, I wanted to know his story. And so I asked him out for lunch at some point in time, and he very reluctantly agreed. And again, during lunch, he wouldn't hardly even look at me. He was depressed. And I heard his story about how people had been very unfaithful to him and broke promises to him, Christian people. And now he was in a place where he was very much questioning the faithfulness of God to him because it seemed that God himself had abandoned him. That's where Ben was at that point in time. And I asked Ben if we could start meeting together to do Renew Ministry. And Ben has told me since then that I had to ask several times before he agreed. And it took some time. Ben was very guarded. I remember that. And it took some time. I think eventually he just understood, okay, maybe this guy just loves me and I can talk to him. And he started opening up and renewing his mind about some things. And I still remember the first time that Ben smiled in one of our counseling appointments. I thought it was going to break his face. Well, many of you know the rest of the story. Ben is always smiling and laughing now, and his story is a story of God's faithfulness. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 says, even if we are faithless, God remains faithful. And that's Ben's story. Life had beaten him up to a point when he felt faithless, but God was still faithful to him, and in the process, Ben has been such a great blessing to me and all of those at New Life Community Church. And through all of those painful struggles, Ben's wife, Jessica, remained faithful to God and her husband. And I can tell you it wasn't easy. Ben and Jessica, would you stand today also so we can thank you for all of your faithfulness to us here at New Life Community Church. I said earlier that I am more amazed by the faithfulness of our people than even God's faithfulness. Because God is always faithful. He's never unfaithful. Again, that's his character. But again, in 30 years of ministry, I have found that being faithful, being loyal is a huge struggle for most Christians. It just doesn't happen. In 30 years, New Life has had the privilege of ministering to several thousand people. I'm not exaggerating. Several thousand people have come and gone here at New Life Community Church. So it prompts this question, why aren't they still here? As we will see in a moment, Christians from the very beginning of the church have struggled to be faithful and loyal to a local church. I don't mean that to be harsh in any way. We are not bitter about that, but we will be honest. If those thousands of people who have come and gone from New Life had loved us as much as we loved them, they would still be here today. I believe that with all my heart. In the Apostle Paul's last letter, he wrote Timothy, you know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. This is an amazing statement, one of the most striking statements in the entire New Testament. The Apostle Paul had ministered in Asia Minor for many years, including the capital city of Ephesus. He was there for 3 years. And sometime later, again, Paul is talking about Christians. He says, they've all deserted me. How is that possible? Paul mentions specifically these Christians, Phygelus and Hermogenes. We're not sure who they were, but Paul was especially surprised and even hurt that they had deserted him. And of course, we have experienced some of that same experience here at New Life Community Church. We've been surprised and hurt by some of the people who have left here. Now, let's just ask a question. Did those Christians desert the Apostle Paul because he did something wrong? Or had the apostles sinned against them in some way? Probably not. So why did those Christians desert the Apostle Paul? Why have a few thousand people left New Life over 30 years of ministry? Why have most churches experienced the same phenomenon of so many people coming and going? Because faithfulness and loyalty has been a problem in the church since its very beginning. It is tempting to think that New Life has done something wrong over all those years, and that explains why all those people have come and gone. That's not true. Even God himself knows that's not true. And God himself would have never wanted most of those people to leave our church, or any church, to be honest with you. I know there are exceptions. Please don't misunderstand me. God does not expect you to stay at a church where the pastors have done something that legitimately causes you to lose your trust and respect for them. But by far, the most common reason people leave churches is that something offended them. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the time, the offense occurred because they actually misunderstood something that someone said or did. This is how the devil works. This is how he's worked. It wasn't even because someone at New Life sinned against them or did anything wrong. They left because they were offended by something they should not have even been offended by and were unwilling to work that out. That has happened thousands of times at New Life Community Church. And again, it's the devil. People become offended because of their own misunderstandings, but then they refuse to work those things out. They refuse to be faithful and loyal, to be honest with you. And remember, we said that loyalty is love. It requires love to be loyal to people, whether in a marriage or in a church. Because even if people really do sin against you, God wants you to forgive them and be reconciled to them. That's if real sin occurs. But I have found many people, even Christian people, have not been humble enough, loving enough, loyal, even faithful enough to find out if their offense was even caused by real sin and be reconciled in those things. Instead, it's been far too easy for Christians in America to just go into another church because there's one right around the corner. That's one thing I appreciate about the churches in Nepal. You get saved in a church and you don't like that church, tough, because the next church is 50 miles away. That would be better if it was that way in America. And again, as I said, many churches in America have experienced this same painful process. And I think it's greatly saddened God. When we stand before Christ, He is not going to be asking us, did you find the church that offended you the least? What will be important to Him is this. Were you loyal and faithful to love a family of believers and stick with them? I can tell you that question is much more important to Christ than it is to most American Christians. And that is why I appreciate the founding members of New Life so much. They know this has never been a perfect church. They know the pastors have made mistakes. There's been things even these founding members did not like about our church. But they remain faithful, loyal, and loving to New Life's leaders and its members. And the same is true of all of you who have been a part of our church for a considerable period of time. I'm telling you, God looks down on Christians in America today and sees very little faithfulness and loyalty. I know if Jesus were here today, He too would be thanking so many of you for your faithfulness to our church, but ultimately it's a faithfulness to Him. Amen? Indeed, New Life is a story of faithfulness and faithfulness of people, but ultimately the faithfulness of God. Today we proclaim with the psalmist, young and old will hear of your faithfulness. Your unfailing love will last forever. Your faithfulness is enduring as the heavens. As we have been reminded of God's faithfulness to our church in the past, let it strengthen our faith that He will continue to be faithful to us no matter what we face in the future. We'll have a beginning our last song here.